This week on Paul Security Weekly, we air a pre-recorded panel from our holiday extravaganza on December 6th on the topic of supply chain security. In the second segment, we air episode 10 of Below the Surface, the supply chain security podcast, featuring special guest Zeno Kova, who discusses learning about firmware security. All that and more on this episode of Paul Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul Security Weekly. Coming to you in super low definition compliments of Darth Vader himself, this is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 809, being recorded on December 6th, 2023, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. We've assembled a crackpot crew sitting around this table. Good Lord. It's going to be an interesting evening.
I think the word you're looking for is motley.
A motley crew, for sure.
Dude, Motley Crue's here?
Yeah.
Wow.
Motley Crue in the house.
Mr. Larry Pesci is here.
It's just same old, same old. We were going to do some hacking this afternoon, and
We got very little hacking.
yeah. I mean,
Yes.
we get like people socializing.
We were socializing more than hacking.
people.
Yes.
Well, that's what happens when people come in from out of town.
That's right.
Yes.
Mr. Matt Alderman is here. Matt, welcome.
I am in the house. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. I was here a month ago doing some recordings, and I'm like, wait, I can be in Boston then, so I'll come down and hang out with this motley crew.
I think the last time you came down, your schedule was like ridiculous.
Oh, yeah. I was starting the new job, and it
Yeah,
was just
yeah.
nuts. So, yeah.
Mr. Bill Brenner is here with us. Bill, welcome.
Thank you. How is everything? It's good to see you again.
Good seeing you. Yeah. It's been a while. It's been a good year to see most of these beautiful faces.
Mr. Josh Marpet, in person, dude. It's been so long since I've seen you in person.
I think it's been
At least 2 years. Yeah,
2 or
a
3
while,
years,
dude.
something like that. Yeah.
It's 3 years. It's pre-COVID.
My doppelganger.
That's right.
My doppelganger. He's mine. Just to be clear.
I think Bill's got a little more gray in his beard now, though.
Do I tell the story about...
No, we don't want to hear your stories, Bill. Jeff Mann is here. What's up, Jeff?
Happy to be here as always, and always excited for the holiday extravaganza.
That's right. Let's see. What do we have to do next now?
There's an announcement, I think.
Today's holiday extravaganza live stream begins now. Stay tuned for all night long. Well, not really all night long.
All
just
night long.
Motley Crue.
It's 4 special panels, hosts from all of our Security Weekly shows joining us here in Rhode Island, as we kind of said. Come chat with us on Discord, securityweekly.com/Discord, if you haven't already. Our topic for this segment is supply chain security. Now, some thought it was a good idea to talk about the various supply chain issues and how they impact different areas, such as I define them as hardware, firmware or low-level software, operating systems and applications, or software you develop yourself. I presume that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, you can take the concept of supply chain a little broader than that, though. It depends on your definition of supply chain.
And my other
I think
example is
that's what we're looking to do, is to define
yeah.
supply chain.
Like Red Cross needs bandages, and they have to maintain a supply chain for bandages. Is
Right.
always my,
But if you think about computing infrastructure these days, they have aspects of you've got the hardware components, but then also the services that run on top. Are those supply chain, or aren't they part of your supply chain? Like, where do you break that down? We used to talk in the early days around third-party risk, right? And so you define this risk, and then it evolved into supply chain, and some mixed the two together. And the question is supply chain also your third parties? Are third parties part of your supply chain, or aren't they? So
No.
the definition can be gray.
The definition is actually pretty straightforward. A third party is somebody one separation from you. I deal with them directly. Supply chain is the third parties, the fourth parties, the fifth parties, the sixth parties.
Yeah, well, so you do have now in third-party risk, for example, Josh, starting to think about fourth, fifth, sixth-party risk, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, they're very similar, and they work together very nicely. But the old definition of vendor risk or third-party risk is one separation, 6 degrees, 1 degree away from you.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and it really is 6 degrees of separation. How many companies are there in the U.S.? Like millions. But how many of them, if you went 3 parties away from a company, you'd find, what did the NSA do? They said it was 3 jumps away from somebody's how far they surveil you. Jeff, do you know anything about that?
But when you look at third, fourth, fifth parties, you start to get this really interesting concentration of suppliers in there, like Azure and AWS and some of the cloud providers, because anybody running infrastructure that you're doing something with fall into these fourth, fifth, sixth, levels away from you. But then I think of supply chain more traditionally, like you just defined it, which is some of those underlying components to manufacture something like a PC or something like that.
Actually,
the hardware is interesting because I think without firmware or software, your hardware is just like a paperweight, basically. So we can talk about the hardware supply chain, but really when I think it gets more interesting for this discussion is talking about software.
Can I do hardware for one more second?
Yeah.
And I want to jump into some hardware too here.
Okay, there's a really great website to visualize hardware supply chains. There's a place called importyeti.com, Y-E-T-I, so importyeti.com. You can actually type in a company like Lululemon and find out who's supplying them from China and wherever they're getting stuff from, or Williams-Sonoma or whatever. All the shipments, they've just ingested all the bills of lading for intercontinental shipping, and they put it together in a database, and it's free, which is really cool. And I think the guy wants to get his company bought, so kudos to him and good luck. But it's an easy way to go, wow, they get it from there, and they get it from there, and they get it from, it's impressively neat to be able to see that. So just fun. Anyway, Larry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I think overlooking a little bit of the hardware supply chain stuff, especially in our industry, you probably shouldn't, because you can definitely deal with counterfeit chip manufacturers.
Yeah.
So if you're, there are some groups like Apple that are buying stuff that are their own silicon that have been made in their own factories, but for a long time when we were doing the Linksys book and subsequently after, like there was FTDI and a few other folks that you'd go to buy like one of those serial adapters. And all of a sudden it wouldn't work because it was counterfeit and they had done something to the drivers to neuter those devices. So understanding some of where the actual hardware is being manufactured and is coming from legitimate folks is good. Because what happens if you get hardware that's been reverse engineered and had some extra functionality in it?
Right, but the threat is really the extra functionality which lives in software.
Not necessarily.
Well, no, you're right.
It's not a threat. It's a vulnerability.
No,
Potential.
If a component has been tampered with, that's to me a threat, not necessarily a vulnerability.
Okay. I'll grant you that.
Okay.
It's a risk.
No, it's definitely not a risk.
No, it's definitely not a risk. Don't get me going there.
Nice try, though.
We'll be tied up all night.
I couldn't resist. It was awesome. Wow. Did you hear the indignation? And it's not a risk. That was awesome.
For giggles, because I love to find definitions of terms, and I was trying to find one that was more generic, that tried to encompass everything. So a very intensive research project involving Google for the last 30 seconds leads me to this definition that I'll throw out for you. Supply chain is a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product to the final buyer. It includes different activities, people, entities, information, and resources. I think so far we've been talking mostly about resources.
Agreed.
Right.
But there's other things involved
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
And you said product,
Yep.
which is interesting because I think of products and services, but the definition doesn't go to the service component, because sometimes you can think of
Unless your service is your product.
correct. Maybe, yeah. And it's just an interesting term that they use, because what is the product? Anyways.
I think the hardware backdoor is interesting, but it still needs software to work. I like this example, and we often don't use this example at my day job because it speaks more to nation state threats. And I think supply chain threats come way far beyond nation states, right? They come from all over. But it was the Russians that had tampered with and put listening devices in the typewriters.
That I can talk about.
Right? That to me is like a classic supply chain attack
Yes.
that still resonates with the threats that we deal with today.
Yep.
Well,
Yep.
actually, you made me think of something, Paul, and that's the Great Seal. Remember the Great Seal at the NSA
Yep.
Cryptologic Museum has no software firmware at all. It's just hardware. Mm-hmm. So there are supply chain attacks that are only hardware with no software or firmware.
And
But
like,
they're, I mean, kind of esoteric and.
Oh yeah, totally.
Well,
I'm
we're-
just nitpicking. I'm just
when
nitpicking.
we talk about what we're dealing with today, it's largely software,
Oh, yeah.
firmware.
Yeah.
yeah, and it's interesting the typewriter one, because for the supply chain thing, like the typewriters were made somewhere that was trusted, and the shipments were from my understanding, the shipments were diverted.
Diverted, right.
They were modified in transit, as it were.
Cisco,
And,
NSA.
and yeah, and then released back just as they had been. But that supply chain could also happen from the manufacturing plant was diverted, as it were.
Or
I think that
hijacked.
addresses a little bit, or goes to the idea that there's activities involved. So part of the idea of supply chain security is not just the things, but also the chain of custody.
Yes.
Right.
Sure.
Well, I mean, SolarWinds is a perfect example of this, right? When you think about it, the attackers actually went in and inserted code into their code repository that created the backdoor, right? And so software, it's also a big component of this, and how you get your stuff into the supply chain, right? And so it doesn't have to be just a piece of manufactured equipment or counterfeit equipment. It could be, I actually injected code into your repository that is now malicious, and how do you detect that? So
Yeah, I also worry very much from a hardware and low-level software level, right? When Larry and I buy in this hardware hackers, we're going to talk about hardware hacking this evening, but when we buy stuff to conduct hacking operations, how secure is that? That's one of my...
Do you mean the purchase or the hardware you buy?
When I go to AliExpress and I buy some knockoff thing...
why the hell are you going to AliExpress?
Because that stuff is cheap.
I saved hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, you should be going to Temu. Come on.
Oh yeah.
Oh, God,
that's
Temu's
just
horrible.
as safe.
I do worry about that tool set supply chain, right? And not just in hardware, but in software tools that are used by researchers as well, which have come under attack, as we've covered on the show.
You just need a hardcore electrical engineer, which I am not anymore, just to build your own tool set. So then you know it's secure.
Or, I mean, there's something to be said for reflashing firmware on it, right? Gaining control at that level helps. It's certainly not a supplement for what you're talking about, Matt, like actually looking at what the hardware is doing, but certainly a fresh firmware install
Come on.
from a known
Unless
good
you're
source is good.
breadboarding it and doing wire by wire,
Right.
it's not safe.
You're right.
Sniffing
That's what
every-
I said.
sniffing
You need
every
a
buzz.
good
Yeah.
electrical engineer that knows his field study to do that. And I used to do that way back in the day. I don't do it anymore.
And part of, and I will argue also that for us, buying stuff from AliExpress that's exactly the purpose, because we know it's probably already compromised.
yeah, you're right.
Bullshit.
Yeah,
Retail therapy. Let's be honest here.
A little bit of both.
for you guys, it's probably great, right? Because it's like,
Oh,
hey,
if we get some of this backdoor, we're also very happy.
yeah,
about
you're
it.
happy
We
about it
investigate
because that's where
yeah.
it's coming from.
But we also have the means and, at least in my case, some of the knowledge to validate that stuff. And there's people that are way better at it than I am, who I ask to help me validate things when I get them,
Yeah.
right? But there's a skill set there that I think is not very easily replaceable by automated software. And we're making strides in that realm. But I want us to get to a place where you can automatically, or in an automated fashion, replicate some of that work to validate what you've gotten. Because I think many of us, and many CISOs have this, kind of train of thinking that when I get stuff, it should be secure to a certain level. I'm like, there's no guarantees. Like when you
No.
buy something, you're just trusting that the supply chain is good. How are you going to validate that in anything that you buy? Hardware, software, PCs, open source libraries, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Wait,
I
isn't
actually-
that what the S-bomb's supposed to do?
Shh, we'll talk about that in a minute. No, I actually, so I was talking to one of those automated pen testing companies, and it's not automated pen testing. Don't everybody scream at me at once.
Did you
Jesus
get an
Christmas.
automated response?
No, I didn't. But what I asked was, so it was a demo, and it's impressive stuff for your very standard Windows, Linux, Mac, for your very standard, x86, IA64 standard architectures, right? I said, okay, tell me about IoT, IIoT, IOMT. Tell me about OT. Tell me about Arch architecture, which we all have Raspberry Pis scattered all over our house. How many of you have them embedded in your walls or something, you know? I said, tell me about PLCs, tell me about, you know, and then he's like, no, we don't touch it. Custom applications, no.
It's a different set of vendors.
Yep.
There's a great software project that I'm working on writing about for my day job. It's called Emba. And it's not completely automated. Like, yes, you give it firmware and it spits out a report, but it's very much just automating the stuff that us security researchers do and like spend a lot of time like customizing tools and techniques, Larry, right? And this kind of took all of that body of knowledge and put it out as open source. Now, there's vendors that commercially do it like to the nth degree, but Emma's the first project that I was like, wow, that like really, they came a long way for like open source project. Like they're not monetizing it, and it really is just like a set of tools and scripts that walks through much of the stuff.
It's arguably it's a force multiplier.
Yeah,
it's automation that helps you be more efficient.
You still need a security researcher, then, Josh, right, to your point, right, to go look at it and go, okay, what's the real threat here? What's the real vulnerabilities here? And validate it and write the exploits. It doesn't write the exploits
right
for you. Now, again, commercially, vendors like Finite State and others have facilities to do that. Microsoft bought a company, and that technology has been developed for quite some time. Reversing Labs does a good job with that too.
But it's still only doing it for certain architectures, for certain systems, for certain whatevers, because
every firmware is a unique snowflake.
That's my point.
Yes,
firmware is firmware is snow falling from the friggin' sky, and every single one is different.
So how do you, and that's the challenge I think we have today, if we stay on the firmware IoT device kind of topic for a moment, is that every firmware is so different that it's really hard in an automated fashion. Larry, you can attest to this, right?
I bet you can.
I can, right? Like,
I mean, it is
so hard.
It is different, but it's also steeped in a lot of the same.
The same.
Like you're dealing.
Like once you pull back the covers, what I'm finding recently when I look at just seemingly random firmware that I find, very old software and libraries still to this day. Modern software that's being deployed on things like firewalls that are protecting control systems infrastructure, old
Linux kernel 2.4.
I'm talking
right?
like
2010,
2013. Like, and it's not hard to. So one of the things that Emba does is it, if it can, and it has done this for me in firmware I've given it, it'll take every binary, and let's say it's a MIPS architecture, and it will use QEMU to run that and just spit back like what version it is and information about it, and then it'll correlate that to CVE. And it's like, oh, you're running an old Linux utility from 2010.
Which has like a bajillion CVEs.
Yeah, and then you go look at the CVE history for that, and I'm like, well, there's like 10,000 vulnerabilities. I mean, that's an
So that actually
let's say there's 100, but there's at least a dozen or so that are like 9.8 CVE severity.
And that goes right back
CVSS.
to what Matt was talking about, which is the VEX project, which is part of the SBOM project.
Yep.
So SBOM's software bill of materials list out what you've got, and the VEX project goes, okay, what vulnerabilities does that have, and does that have, and does that have, and does that have? And so that's effectively Emba is
still just scratching the surface. Though.
Oh, totally. But Emba is effectively facilitating the VEX project effectively.
Correct.
Yep. VEX and VDR. We'll add VDR to that. Yeah.
Can you explain VDR?
Basically the same thing as VEX.
It's not exactly the same, though, is it?
It's the theory is the same. The language output is a little different. That's all. It's like Cyclone DX versus
SPDX or
SPDX.
or SWID tags or whatever. Yeah.
Yep. Oh, SWID is dead.
But the other side of that coin, and we can move up the stack as well to things like drivers and such, is not just looking at vulnerabilities, but is this a utility that could be used maliciously? Software that could be used maliciously in the case of drivers, right? Or has it been tampered with? Which isn't not really it's not like a memory corruption vulnerability, but someone's tampered with it to put some kind of backdoor in it.
Yep.
And how do you distinguish all these various components and detect has the supply chain been tampered with?
Right.
In this case.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is kind of the premise for the SBOM, was the ability to at least inventory all the stuff, know what's in it, so you know what is the foundation for that.
Right.
And then you can look at it and go, oh, these have vulnerabilities, so do we really want to use this product, this piece of software, or not?
Again, it's one side of the coin,
right.
in my
It
opinion.
is one side of the coin. And again, if this is where on the application side it gets so interesting, right? Is when you think about how modern software is built, it's changed the vectors, threat vectors, of of how you could tamper and get into that code base, right? Where when you used to just do C, compile it, put it, it's a different process. It was a lot tighter of a process back then, right? But as we've modernized,
we've always shared code. I go back to my example of in the early days, I believe it was at MIT, in punch cards in the
Just because you
mainframe
steal
computer.
code all the time doesn't mean it's being shared, Paul.
Well, they were purposely sharing. They weren't stealing. They weren't stealing it.
You reuse.
You're reusing it. There was a drawer with punch cards in it, and you could pick up some punch cards and use them in your own program. To me, that was one of the earliest examples of reusing libraries and code. And when you scooped up, those punch cards, you weren't necessarily going through. Maybe some people did, but going through every single one, and going like, is this really the code that I want to run in my program? But now we've exponentially increased this code reusage. To AI, where I think most of us, if we need to write some code, will go to ChatGPT, especially if it's Python, and go, hey, generate me a script for this. Now we can see that code on the screen and visually inspect it, but oftentimes we're incorporating libraries that other people have written, components that other people have written. I go to my Zycel or Zixil. I looked up how you pronounce it. I used to pronounce it Zixil. Apparently the right pronunciation is Zycel. But they had an issue with their IPsec stack. Now, anyone who's worked with IPsec before, for me, it was like more than 20 years ago where I started like learning IPsec because I had to do a VPN project in probably 2001 or so. And so I started, like, the documentation I had back then was like, I gotta go read the RFCs. I'm like, oh my God, I just want to rip my eyes out. This is horrible. It's very complex. And so when you're a manufacturer or OEM in the supply chain and you go, I want to implement IPsec in my product, are you going to go write that yourself?
No.
Only if you're absolutely insane today are you going to write that yourself.
So you're
or if you're in the federal government.
So you're going to go to the drawer.
To your
feds
point,
might.
but to your point, Matt, some people will go through the
Yeah.
step. And it goes like my coffee analogy. You're going to make your own coffee. You're going to go to the store and you're going to buy a bottle of coffee or anywhere
Or
in
you go
between.
to the drawer and you grab those couple punch cards that are the
Right. And
IPsec
so, but
stack, right?
in this case with IPsec, you go to a company that has done the painstaking work of reading all the RFCs, writing all of the code, testing all of the code to have an IPsec stack. Back in the day, and I'm still working on a timeline, but I believe that first company was called SafeNet. And SafeNet was acquired, and then that company that acquired SafeNet was acquired, and then the company that acquired, I think there was like 3 levels of acquisitions of these companies, and that's who ultimately maintains this software today. My point from a supply chain perspective was, who else runs this software? And maybe it doesn't look exactly like Zycel had it in their product. It might look slightly different, but is the vulnerability still there or not? And how do we know if we look? How do we know we even need to look?
Yeah.
I think they call that supply link. When you take all the links and all the supply chain is now one company, it's just a link.
Or they're the originator
A
of
Linksys?
that, originator of that supply chain. There is an original source of that supply chain for this software.
Yeah, but the problem comes in when you have a scenario like that with
Multiple
layers of-
acquisitions.
Multiple acquisitions, right.
Finding somebody that knows how anything works, or
Correct.
how it was
Right.
written, or
Yeah.
How do you
Was it
fix this?
forked and somebody created a version of it like
If I license it,
Nessus before 2.0 or something like that?
I gotta be careful. If someone were to look inside the firmware and start to look at how it was put together, you could easily come to the conclusion that it was modified by the person who licensed it, right?
Oh.
Is my friend Bob's sense of how this happened, right? And so, given that, how do we know who's introduced new vulnerabilities? How do we know if they have this particular vulnerability, and so on and so forth?
So, quick question, Paul: Are we still defining supply chain, or have we?
We've moved on from that. And if you want to define some more, we can define some more stuff.
Well, no,
Well, you
we're
want to talk
fine-
about the people
We're
and
fine with the definition.
activities
Well, no,
and
at some point, hopefully, there's other questions
okay.
that we're trying to answer. But
The question is trust.
Correct.
There
The
is
question
a
is
trust and
trust.
a quest.
I have to be able to trust that the suppliers of my firmware, software, hardware, anything, are reliable, that it hasn't been affected in transit, as we talked about transportation, that it hasn't been modified, that it hasn't been changed, that it hasn't been screwed with. Oh my gosh, look at that. That's the CIA triad. Amazing, isn't it? And I've got to make sure that I trust every step of that supply chain along the way. SBOM and VEX and VDR, I think it was, right?
Yes.
Are attempts to do that.
Right.
But how do you actually trust a supply chain?
No, but I like that, Josh, because I think of some of the issues we've had in the supply chain realm with libraries and such. And while I feel like I know where the responsibility should fall, but what if there is a vendor that maintains software or has software but isn't maybe maintaining it, and they're not looking to see if they have a vulnerable component. They've shipped it. They got customers paying for it.
They're done.
And they're done. And a new vulnerability comes out. All of us in cybersecurity, we're talking about it, but they're like, like they don't look. Like it's just not in their process to look.
Or they're not maintaining that.
Or they're not maintaining
that component
or it's
anymore.
Acquisition train of that happened. And maybe some versions of that had it in, but they only looked in the recent version. Like, we're not going back to all those other versions, but you could have maintained, maybe you had a license for that older version, and that's still what you have. But through acquisition, that got locked. That's where I think the QuickSec vulnerability.
You know, I had a friend who was worked at a large manufacturer of computers, and when we talked about service and service level agreements, and he said you maintain 2 levels back from the current model. That's what you maintain, and it rolls forward as you put out a new model. You maintain 2 layers back, and that's it. And I said, well, what about the people that bought 3 years ago, 4 years ago? That's why you make them buy new.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's the I think that's part of the root of this challenge, right? Is that if you have these devices in the field, and if they're not upgradable, it's a huge cost to go through and replace all these devices with something new that's got the newer components in it. Mm-hmm. So this is what happens when we think about operational technology, SCADA, PLCs, etc. A nuclear plant when was the last nuclear plant built in the United States? 20 some years ago, right? Think about all the hardware that's sitting in there that's part of the original construction that they haven't replaced yet. There's probably vulnerabilities sitting in that code base somewhere.
I'll give you a story that's from a friend of mine. I will not name. He worked on a lot of energy generation stuff, and the story is fantastic. There's a transformer on a border of the United States. I won't tell you which border, won't tell you where it is. But it's to
probably
help
north or south.
Probably to move electricity across that country border. Okay, and it's a huge monster transformer. It's like millions of gallons of oil, right? Cooling oil. And
I'm thinking north, but
it's rated as
it's almost overseas.
It's rated as one single unit that is not to be touched, upgraded, and replaced anything until I think 2068, 2069, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. Floating in the oil is a main board for monitoring and what's the temperature of the oil, what's going on with this thing, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not allowed to be touched because it's listed as part of this transformer. It's running NT351.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it won't be touched until 2068.
Right.
I'm surprised it's been that long without a reboot.
Hey, NT was stable, man. What's wrong with you?
NT4 was stable, not 351.
Yeah, okay, good point.
Well, I'm glad you brought up responsibility, Paul, because this is where I was hoping we would go. Responsibility, accountability, liability, and
Salsa.
Because I live in the. Am I coming up with an acronym? I'm sorry.
No. There's one out there called SLSA, Salsa.
Oh, well, I don't have any original thoughts.
That tries to deal with the accountability, and the traceability.
It's actually really good.
But also from from the world
Salsa.
that I come from, which is the compliance world, PCI. I can't think of any one of my customers that I've ever had in 20 years that would think about all this stuff.
Well, that's because PCI is still outdated and isn't addressing the issue yet.
Until version 4.
Even version 4 does not speak to a lot of the supply chain issues that we've already mentioned in this segment.
Well,
PCI Council is coming on this location now.
But my question is there a compliance standard out there that does?
No.
524B.
It does what specifically?
Does what? Yeah, what specifically?
Touches on any of the issues and concerns that we've been talking
NIST
about.
CSF definitely does. The latest update, absolutely.
That's not
You're talking about
2.0, but it's not published yet.
That's not published. That's not out for another week.
Well, I don't know. If you know that it's coming out in another week, my roadmap changes. So if you have got inside,
it comes out in a week or two.
Okay, because that's one of the items on my roadmap because I don't know when it's coming out. It said early 2024. So what the hell does that mean?
No, it's out, and it was publicly announced that it was coming out in the next few weeks. I don't remember exactly when. Forgive me, but
Oh,
Well, in a draft version,
the
of
draft
standard-
has
yeah,
been
draft
out.
has been out.
Yeah,
No,
it
no,
was-
no.
The draft
Final.
contains a lot of supply chain language.
It does.
Okay, so let's
you
say
can,
it's,
you can go to Eclipsium's YouTube
let's say
channel
it's
and see
in
my
CFF
webinar on it.
version 2. There isn't an agency in the private sector, an organization in the private sector that's bound to follow that.
No.
So
No.
it's kind of
You're right.
volatile.
It's so CSF is more of a framework than it is a regulatory requirement.
So another one that might be a
But I think-
regulatory
I think
requirement would be
CM I think-
524B.
But also, I think CMMC is going to use CSF 2.0 as the standard.
Josh, when is CMMC actually going to get its act together and get off the ground? Oh,
That's our third roundtable discussion.
Fuck you.
So those are the ones I know about that I think are on the cusp of. I think moving into next
Correct.
year, we're going to have to start dealing with all
yeah,
of that.
I mean, CSF 2.0 does a couple interesting things, right? It adds supply chain control areas, which I think is good. It also creates a whole new function around govern, which is interesting. But you're right, Paul. Outside of that, there's not a lot. And to Jeff's point, it's a framework, right? So you can adopt the framework or not adopt the framework, but it's
Right.
not a regulatory compliance requirement, right?
It's not a requirement.
Exactly. And so, not that I want to go down this rat hole, but a lot of people have to think about this not necessarily at the control level or at the regulatory level. What's the risk to the organization? Is there a high enough risk that I should actually do something about my supply chain? This comes back to a risk conversation at the end of the day. You can only regulate, I think, so much. And unless somebody does and forces it on everybody, it's going to be hard unless there is a huge risk component to supply chain that people will actually start to do something about it.
And when we start talking regulations, and I've mentioned a couple of times 524B, which is FDA related. So you're talking about risk,
Yep.
and you have software supply chain issues where they're going to require SBOMs, and they're going to
yeah.
require them be enhanced.
Try again. Because every time I deal with FDA regulations and fucking X-ray machine companies, like, we won't update Windows 7 because it's not FDA cleared, and we have to go through the entire FDA process again. And I'm like, fuck you, you're wrong.
Yep.
The FDA has publicly stated that you can update the software to modern day equivalents, and it's no problem. And they're like, we're not going to do it.
Yeah. So their new stuff, anyways. If you want
Sorry.
to take your medical device to market, and it's got software on it, you have to be providing SBOMs. You have to do some vulnerability analysis. You have to have pen testing, and
Where's the requirements to update?
There are requirements to update.
How often?
I don't know. There is
Then it's going to be, we will update every 6 years, whether it needs it or not.
Periodically.
Can you define periodicity, please? Thank you very much. You're fucked. Okay.
And quite honestly, that is because I have not looked at it in a couple of weeks, and they've done some updates and they've done some more clarification because they were very wishy-washy about it. But to my point,
FDA wishy-washy?
No.
Oh my God.
But my point
Who
is,
would have thought?
there are regulations.
I'm sorry.
There
that's
are
rude.
regulations. There are new regulations, and they do address some areas that have some pretty significant risk. Like
Okay. To be
not dying.
clear, if the FDA would like to come on the show, we would welcome you to discuss these things and help you out. Honest to God, we'd help you out. I promise.
And I
They've
think
gotten better over the last couple of months. So
but it's hard. This kind of stuff is hard to regulate. It's
It is.
easy
No,
to
it is.
it's easy to regulate going forward.
It's hard to regulate what's
It's
bad.
hard to go back and clean up all the historical
Right.
text
Well, that's
debt
the-
stuff.
You
Like,
never- you
oh
never-
my gosh.
That's
never
a classic cybersecurity problem, right? It's cleaning up the
you never
past.
will.
Paul,
How many
Paul.
hospitals are going to go out and replace all their X-ray machines, their imaging machines,
They're
this, that, and the
not.
other
They're
stuff? Because they're
happening.
not. Because the
Paul.
cost is too much. They'll absorb the risk.
Yeah. How many devices don't even have the memory to have a CRL on them? I mean, like tons of them, right? How many devices can't even put a certificate revocation list on and still think that,
Well,
that
I think,
certificates
but I
from
think that's part of the
Komodo
problem. Is
are good?
I think newer devices can,
Yep.
but older devices can't. Because
Not
I
if
think
you get them
we've
off
seen-
AliExpress.
So, but we're back to then.
Comes with
the
its own
solution is to
CRL.
upgrade and spend a lot of money on new stuff,
But you don't
which
necessarily.
most companies don't
the
like. to
They're
do.
not going to do, because if we go back to the risk calculation, it's probably cheaper for them to accept the risk than it is to replace all the hardware. So they'll accept the risk.
for a period
Why
of
is
time.
it cheaper? Why is it cheaper?
For a period of time until that medical equipment becomes obsolete, or
or
something
until
becomes
someone
obsolete.
dies. Until
And
someone dies.
Right.
well, it's just like your car.
They'll
like
pay that. They count that in the cost of the risk, someone dying. That's not a joke.
No, I know.
No,
They
I know.
count that in the cost of the risk.
we,
Right.
we've all seen Fight Club. I mean, think about your car. think like
Nobody talks
you're
about
you're
Fight
not going to
Club.
buy a new car until it's become quote obsolete or your end of lease is up, and then you go replace it, and the new one that you bought a couple of years later or you're leasing a couple of years later has got all these new safety features that have met. Same sort of thing applies here. This is not a
Larry,
new
how
problem.
old is your car?
Mine? Not relatively old, but
Mine-
my wife's is 17 years old.
Okay.
So,
Okay, mine's 14,
Mine's 15.
but it only has
18 years
16,000
old.
miles on it.
18 years old.
Mine, you still have to crank it to start.
I have a Tesla. I have a whole different set of problems.
Oh, I bet you do. You want to talk about software
Oh my God,
vulnerabilities?
the whole thing is basically
It's all software.
a computer and a battery and wheels. That's really
Yeah.
all,
So I
have-
all it is.
I have another question. In everyone's opinion, is the responsibility for supply chain awareness, let's say, always the end user organization, or what's the sweet spot?
It can't
It's
be.
sha- it's
For
sha-
where it
it's
should be.
shared. It has to be every link in the supply chain of the suppliers has to do something to help these supply chain issues that we're talking about. The government regulations have to help everyone push towards supply chain issues that we're talking about and solutions.
Oh, that's
that we're
another
talking
regulation. Where does regulation fit in? Not or
Wait,
regulation, legislation.
back up. Go back to your responsibility question because I disagree slightly.
Okay.
I agree
And
with
also,
you.
there's
Go ahead.
responsibility on the end consumer as well.
Yeah, there is.
But we need things from upstream suppliers. They should provide us things like S-bombs as an example.
Yes.
So-
but we also
and
have to
we
check that
need
stuff.
penalties.
And we need- yes.
there have to be sanctions and they have to have teeth for responsibility to be actually real. End of
Oh,
story.
you mean the new SEC requirements?
Yeah, well, sort of. That's got
I
some
fear that
ramifications.
yes.
that are
these
awkward.
S-bombs
I do, I know.
will be at the last page of the EULA that you have to click on to accept.
Right, to
be able
accept.
use it.
It really boils
wrong,
down to some level of disclosure. What you want from the suppliers is some level of disclosure. The S-bomb is one mechanism to disclose. These are the elements that make up this piece of code or whatever, right? So the S-bomb does part of that from a disclosure perspective. But when a vulnerability gets identified, and we're going to talk about this in a panel later, that vulnerability disclosure should also come out, right? And disclose that information. There's a vulnerability. It's in a version you either have to upgrade or you have to replace. Like, it just has to be,
Automobile recalls.
it just has to be disclosed. So the end user
no. It has
can
to
make
be
a decision about what they want to
More
do.
than disclosed. It has to be pushed. It has to be, hey, you bought one of these from us 12 years ago. Are you still using it? If so, here's a patch. It has to be like an automobile recall, where if you have a recall on a piece in your automobile, it doesn't matter if it's 20 years ago. They're going to call you. They're going to mail you. They're going to email you. They're going to be like, hey, you might have a car that has this. Okay. And you can register your car with any of the manufacturers. Say, I bought this third hand. They don't give a crap. Okay. But you have it. That's cool. There's a recall on it. Here, sign up for the recall fixing. It has to be pushed, not just disclosed. Forgive me.
Is there
You're
a concept
right.
of
I'm
warranty
extending.
in any
Yeah,
of
yeah,
this?
I hear you.
Is there a concept of warranty in any of this? Do companies, do suppliers vouch for anything that they produce anywhere along?
In some areas, they probably do, but those are going to be limited. Nobody's going to give you an unlimited warranty. Even the car manufacturers don't give you an unlimited warranty, except for certain recall items, to your point, Josh, right? It doesn't matter if the car is in warranty or out of warranty. If your airbag accidentally explodes, it's a recall. It's going to get replaced.
My 15-year-old Subaru had some of those their airbags, and I got the letter, and I'm like, it's a 15-year-old Subaru, and I took it in, and they replaced the airbags. Okay, cool.
No, like now, and then that raises the questions about when does something go end of life? Like, Paul, when's your Tesla go EOL?
I don't know. I leased it for just that reason, so I can just get a new one.
There you go.
But so now that Tesla is going to get turned back into Tesla, they're going to sell it on the used market, and then someone buys it. Now, when does that car go end of life? Because we've seen like so many of the hardware tools and Wi-Fi tools that we've been using for a long time because they're awesome. They're now end of life, and you can't get them anymore.
You can't even get them, right?
Like, you can't physically get the hardware because they've been superseded by something else. And what happens when the head unit goes in your Tesla?
Your
And you
vintage,
can't-
your
and
vintage, your classic,
can't
classic
get one.
Tesla.
You can't get one anymore. Okay.
Yeah.
Now we're going to have vintage X-ray machines.
So,
Cesium
slightly off
tastes
on a
like sugar.
tangent, but do you foresee a future where we still have classic antique cars that people will fix up and drive around? 50 years from now, are there going to be people driving around 50, 60-year-old Teslas that they fixed up, and do they become antique cars?
That's already happening. It's not antique, but there's already people that rip apart Teslas and build other Teslas from them.
But my question is there going to be a concept when so much of the car is technology and software? Is there going to be a way to have an antique car 50 years from now?
I mean,
that's
people
an
are-
antique Tesla.
I mean, as long as the battery works.
But people are
reason
going
why
to
it can't.
Does
People are
Tesla
gonna
have a
upgrade the
kill
batteries.
switch? Does Tesla have a kill switch in the contract that you sign when you buy the car? Does anybody know?
I know there is for like the automated driving stuff. Like,
Yeah.
like there is a way to turn that license on and turn that license off.
Oh, and it doesn't transfer with
And
the
it
car.
doesn't
by the
No,
way.
it does not transfer with the car. So my guess is there is an Uber kill switch somewhere
There
in
has
the
to be,
software.
and if so, does it automatically go off at like 12 years or 15 years or something?
I don't know.
That'd
We should get Musk on and ask him.
Elon, come on the show.
But the way that people will maintain that is through vulnerabilities. Historically, that's what I've seen, is that the older tech gets maintained through vulnerabilities. Like older gaming consoles are also a good example of a heavily controlled platform, right? And the reason for that heavy control is not really for security of the device, it's to protect the device from the user so that they can't pirate games because it hits their bottom line. So to maintain these older gaming platforms, we rely on vulnerabilities that allow us to gain root access and do what we want on them. That still could land you in prison, potentially, because you're essentially stealing. In some cases, a long history there.
You're hacking.
You're hacking, for sure.
And now we take that to the Tesla. And arguably, the Tesla is a little different in that I heard they just open sourced everything.
No.
Yeah.
I didn't hear that.
Really?
Yeah.
Could you build your own Tesla?
Good luck.
One of the ECUs on the vehicle uses the main one uses AMD chips, and recently, Black Hat researchers we talked about this on the show. It was a voltage glitching attack they used to be able to exploit and gain control of some features. Now, you couldn't turn on automated driving. For some reason, that was protected in a different way.
It's because it's money.
But if you wanted to, I don't know. When I bought my Tesla, it came with the heated seats and heated steering wheel. I don't remember if that was an option or not when I leased it.
Oh, you got a hot ass.
Or if, and I tell you what, I don't use I use my heated steering wheel, my heated seat more so than I use my heat.
Especially
nice.
today, buddy.
Yeah, it was awesome. Got my Tesla, but that's a feature you have to turn on or off on certain models. And they figured out they could bypass those restrictions using voltage glitching.
So from November 22nd, from Big Daddy Musk himself, all design and engineering of the original Tesla Roadster is now fully open source. Whatever we have, you have. Service.tesla.com/Roadster.
So that's the Roadster.
That's the original.
That
that's
is the original
yeah.
Roadster. But still, this is 2008. This could start to be down that vintage automobile route.
But this is
This could be
this
be an antique Tesla.
Now, there's a trucking company called Edison Motors that's building electric logging trucks.
Good luck with that.
And they have it. It's done. It's actually really impressive. And there's another company called Mutiny that's associated with Edison Motors.
To Matt's point, though, I think you said it was 20 years ago since the nuclear power. We're going to need a lot more of those if we start having to power trucking.
Oh no, it's got a diesel generator in it, so it produces its own power.
Its own power to drive the electric motor.
But yeah, to build to power the batteries, it runs in its most efficient mode, so you don't spool it up, spool it down, and lose a lot of power. It's absolutely the most efficient way to do that.
That's interesting.
So that's like a Tesla.
So it's like a Tesla.
with a trailer hitch
it's like
with
a Prius.
generator.
It's like a Prius.
A little tiny gas engine to charge the batteries.
It's a diesel-powered Prius.
I was going to say it's the Tesla with the trailer hitch with a generator in the trailer, running the generator to charge the batteries.
Well, the guy
That's
from
the extended
Edison
range
Motors had a
model.
really good point. He's like, look, one of these things to do a day of work takes something like I forget what he said, but a megawatt of electricity. He goes, so you have thousands of these scattered across the country. There's absolutely no way that we have enough generation or transmission capacity to fill them. And he was absolutely right.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, so what we've done is we put the generator in there. We run it in the absolute most efficient way possible. And this generator will run biodiesel, will run diesel, will run this, that, and the other thing. So it is possible to do it in a carbon neutral way.
Now, compressed natural gas or
Whatever you
LP
need,
would
exactly.
be another
Just-
source for this,
exactly.
too.
But you can run it the most absolutely possible efficient way, plus the electrical axles that they use, the E-axles they call them, are oomphy powerful, man. Oh my God, they're impressive.
Oh, I mean, you know this driving your Tesla. Like it's it's instant and it's linear. It just goes.
I think I'm definitely like 3 for 3 against Hondas.
Oh, yeah.
For sure.
It's not.
1984 Honda Accords. Watch out. It's Paul with the Tesla.
A friend of mine who will remain nameless because of this particular subject frequently trade videos of us. I mean, my friends, not me. My friends trade videos of that.
Bob.
Yeah, Bob trades videos of them blowing stuff away off the line.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
So I have another question to try to shift gears a little bit.
Yeah, because we were talking about supply chain, and then we got started on electric vehicles.
But so back to supply chain, just like everything else in our world, vulnerabilities are pervasive, and you can't remediate all of them all the time.
Correct.
So what are the other things that we do to
Mitigate.
Wow.
And are they the same types of things, or are there different unique types of things that organizations should consider for mitigation of supply chain vulnerabilities?
Yeah, Paul, are you building a firmware firewall?
Oh, believe me, I'd love to.
So zero trust is a
I'd
big
love
part of
to.
that.
Yeah.
Zero trust isolates and separates modules of code, modules of hardware, modules of what you're building. And if I can have an API gateway in between, I can stick the equivalent of a WAF in there and start looking for things that are not supposed to be there. I can look for anomalous commands, anomalous network traffic, anomalous whatever. It's not 100%. It's not perfect. Nothing is.
No, I mean,
it's better.
this is what we were trying to do at Layered Insight, was we were trying to do it within the container in a
Right.
containerized architecture,
Right.
right? And so if you insert the instrumentation inside the container and you can control and you segment all those containers, then you create some level of zero trust across those container environments.
Exactly. Same idea. So zero trust, SBOMs, and supply chain security really all do work together pretty nicely. It's a little weird to think about it that way, but that's what it's designed for.
Yeah, but the approaches are unique.
What do you mean? Sorry.
Well, I mean, when you think about some of these components, right, we have to think about them in new ways than we've traditionally thought
Yeah,
about.
absolutely agree.
Right?
Absolutely
Because
agree.
it's not you're not popping in a Palo Alto or a Cisco PIX or a Checkpoint. I mean, these are very specialized,
Customized,
sensor
absolutely.
kind of capabilities for this type of technology.
So
Cisco picks.
I'm going to say one concept that I've had that I've been
Showing
talking.
your age.
Oh, yeah.
Cisco PIX. Oh, that's right.
Come on, I
Jesus.
was Firewall 1 certified for Checkpoint
Yeah!
in like 1996, guys. 7, something like that.
Renee, your dad's old. Anyway.
Yeah, I am.
She already knows.
She
So
knows.
I'm going to point out that 20 years ago, when Matt knew his shit. So,
Yeah, when I knew my shit. Thanks, Josh.
I'm sorry. It's so rude.
They ran on Solaris back then. And
They
for
did?
those younger listeners, Solaris was developed by Sun Microsystems back in the day.
And it
It
was-
was a version of Unix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell him about VAX. Come on, Daddy. Tell him about VAX.
Fax VMS, baby. They ran the nuclear power plant.
System 5
11780s.
units, to be specific,
11780s.
Oh my
not
God.
to be confused with BSD.
Oh,
So-
but there were
Very
also
true.
PDP 11s. Like, oh, we can go way back if you want to.
No, it's okay. A long time ago, every company was its own thing. Every company did all of its data processing, data generation, data everything inside its own little world. That's why we had these things called firewalls and perimeters. Once we deperimeterized and got supply chains and started sharing data with everybody under the sun who said, hi, I can process your data for you. Just send me data, big boy. Then we had supply chains. Okay.
And that's how Josh imagines them.
Yes.
For the record.
He does.
Fantasizes, not imagines. Fantasizes.
Okay. I mean,
Anyway, so once we started sharing data with everybody under the sun, we had this thing called the supply chain. So why do we still go it alone with every company? Why is every company still trying to do security on their own?
Whoa, that's a really interesting concept.
In reality, we should do this. In the old days, it was a single cell organism, right? Does that make
That
sense?
goes back to responsibility.
And
does.
there we
I-
go.
and I don't trust anybody but me. I mean,
But the point is, we
Trust
have to.
no one.
If you're in a supply chain, you're buying something from somebody. Okay, I'm buying from
You're
Larry.
creating some level of trust, whether you like it or not.
You're-
we've
creating a
talked about
relationship.
trust on this show before as like the number one problem.
Bingo.
With
So if I'm buying from Larry and I go, Larry is a little weird
have you
sometimes.
seen that guy?
Yeah, seriously. But I'm buying from him, which means I have to have some value of trust in him. Now, I get that trust via survey. That's crap. Let's be honest. Every survey out there is crap. Anybody wants to tell me that surveys are good, I'm going to say that's nice. Go away.
Let's take a survey and see how many people think they're crap.
I like it. But if you have a way to trust what he's saying, that his security is actually halfway decent, then I can trust what he's turning out as well. So we have to go to some form of multicellular security where we have, multi-celled organisms out there that work together and share the cost and share the burdens to have security together. Now, will it happen? Probably not in my lifetime, but that's what I think should happen.
Which is, you're never going to get that from AliExpress.
It's a digital.
You're never going to get that
kumbaya.
from AliExpress,
because
which is going to
trust
incentivize you.
But trust is not the driver. It's cost.
It's cost.
But
It's
you're
my
cost.
it's my
You're
Android.
right.
It's my analysis of the
But if
Android
you-
TV research. Right. I go to Amazon. I buy an Android TV
Because it's $12.
It's $12. I've trusted it. Well, maybe 30, but I've trusted it. I'm gonna plug it into my network. I'm gonna enter my credit card numbers and passwords on it potentially, and I've done nothing to validate.
But
and,
if you
and
don't
no
have-
regulation has made them be secure or say they shouldn't have back doors on it.
Right. But if you have those things you bought from AliExpress, you're having a break in that trust relationship because you're doing it for cost. If you choose to take that risk, that's your choice. That's fine. It's your choice. But if I'm in your supply chain and I see that there is that break in trust or that lack of trust in that relationship between you and AliExpress, I'm gonna be like, nope, you're not a supplier of mine anymore. And that's what needs to happen.
Yeah, so you bring up a point, Josh, that gets really interesting is cost versus trust and the offset of risk, right? Because that's what this boils down to in some respect, right? It is, am I willing to take the risk to buy this thing from this source that I may not trust, but it's the cheapest, and am I willing to accept the risks associated with that decision?
Some people say ignorance
Matt, I
is
love you.
bliss. We say ignorance is risk.
Ooh, I like that.
Can I get that on a sticker?
Sure.
T-shirt.
Seriously, I'm not joking. I'd love that on a
should
sticker.
do that.
Yeah, I'm serious. I'd love that on actually a Velcro patch. I want it on my back.
So I'll
got it.
I'll give you a great example of one of those. Back in the day at In Guardians, I was doing some research on one of these kids' toys when that was all the rage with my friend Kayla that connected to the internet.
Tickle Me
books
Elmo.
to you,
Oh.
kind of those.
That thing is creepy.
Do you know what they do when they make sure it works when Tickle Me Elmo comes from the factory?
They tickle it?
They give it 2 testicles. But one of these toys that we were working on, we pulled it all apart, and it was from a reputable company, Fisher Price. And we pulled it all apart, and the main board is from a company called All Winter Tech.
Oh God, that's the same company that makes Android TV boards.
And,
that are backdoored.
and
Yes,
they make Android tablets. And sure enough, this was an All Winter Tech. It's literally an Android tablet.
It's an ARM Cortex processor
that they pulled the
usually, right?
screen
Yeah.
off of, and
Yeah.
they shoved inside this teddy
Yep.
bear.
Are you serious?
Yep.
Yep.
It doesn't surprise
God
me at
damn.
all.
But an SBOM and a hardware bill of materials and a software bill of materials would have revealed that.
Yeah,
And so
because
it's-
we would have seen all winner, but the only people that would have recognized that as bad was like me, Larry, and a few other
5 or 10 other
Like,
people, yeah.
And about a
wait, that's bad.
and about
Don't do that.
3,000 other people that bought Android tablets from AliExpress from Allwinner because they were
Yeah.
$12 for a
Because they're
tablet.
cheap.
Yeah.
It's cost.
Now, really,
Yep.
I know we're running out of time, but I want to make one last point, and that is that we're talking about the retail market, the consumer end user market against the organizational market, and the organizational market is different in its perception of risk and its ability to accept risk.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the retail market, yeah, they're not going to know what All Winter Tech is. When we talk about the enterprise market, the
We should
organizational
know.
market,
We
We should know. And if we don't know, it's shame on us.
Amen.
If only we had a solution
Only if we had a disclosure process.
that could tell you about the supply chain risk of a particular device.
Oh my gosh.
We have an Eclipsium, but
Caesar, you really want to come talk to us? Come on the show. Come on, Caesar.
all right, that will wrap this segment. We're gonna take a short break, and then we're gonna come back. So stay tuned.
Yay.